Chapter 13: Self-Development. The topic is about a kind of attention to the self, remembrance of the self, or attention to one's essence, or what is called self-cognition, a topic which can be traced to the first chapter on morality. The said topic is already concluded. We shall deal with two other principles which are considered part of the moral and educational foundings or foundations of Islam, and by doing so, we will end up discussing this subject in general. One of them is the question of universal conscience. As stated in the previous sessions, there is no doubt that in its moral and educational principles, Islam campaigns against any individual or personal self. Egoism, in the sense of self-centeredness that requires the negation of others, is the same thing which, according to the logic of Islam and other moral systems, is something unpleasant and must be rejected. There is also the concept of egoism and selfishness in our jargon today. For example, we say that so-and-so is an egotistical or selfish person, and we have said that this self is something different from the humane and celestial self of every person. Rather, it has to do with the natural or earthly self of man. Man as a multidimensional being. Man has two types of eyes. One eye is celestial, which is the same thing mentioned in the Qur'an in this manner. I breathed into him of my spirit. And this is found in Surah 15, verse 28 to 29. For its subsistence and survival, this I is not in need of nature. However, man is a multidimensional being. One dimension of its existence is natural. The peculiarity of man is that he is a being with different dimensions and stations. That, quote, man is an animal, vegetal, and inanimate angel, quote, is true, not in the sense that he is an angel as well as an animal, a plant as well as an inanimate object. Instead, he is only a single being, but having multiple dimensions. For example, he is like a multiple-story building. One story of it is a reality. Another story constitutes another reality. Man is such a multidimensional being, and that his highest station is that of an angel. Nay, even higher than that of a plant in another aspect, that of an inanimate object in yet another aspect. In view of this lofty station, he does not make any difference among the eyes. Just as war and conflict, as well as I's and we's, do not exist among the angels, in the said lofty station he does not see any I's and we's between himself and others. They are like sparks of light that know no conflict with one another in any form. But as he reaches his earthly or natural station, as dictated by tortuous circumstances that exist in nature, every eye strives to ensure his protection and survival, thereby naturally negating others. In this manner, the issue of struggle for existence and the like come into being. It is the I of everyone pitted against others' eyes. It means the state of monopoly and disregard for others, which is an essential condition of human nature. These must be opposed and crushed. They are a wall that must be broken down, the wall of the natural I against other eyes. In the words of Allama Tabatabai, man is an employer, being in the sense that he wants to employ other creatures, including his fellow human beings. In today's jargon, man is an exploiter in the sense that he treats everyone or everything as a utility for himself. Rumi says, "The soul of wolves and dogs are separate from one another. That which unites the souls of lions is God." When the soul of man becomes that of a dog or a wolf, in the sense that he loses his own real self and his being is predominantly controlled by his natural impulses. The result is nothing but war, conflict, or competition. All become wolves and dogs, which are embodiments of war and conflict. But if the soul remains divine and does not become that of a wolf or a dog, war and conflict basically cannot exist. Marriage as the first stage of exit from the individual self. Concerning the issue of the self, when we say that man must come out of the shell of self-centeredness, which the earthly self is concerned with, everybody accepts it. Coming out of the shell of self-centeredness and individualism has different stages and levels. Its first stage is the love of others. In reality, it is like saying that the I of man, in the words of Russell in his book New Hopes and others, develops. Since they only know of the earthly I, naturally they start from there. For instance, a child is only in his or her individualistic self, seeing only himself and desiring everything for his own individualistic self. He treats his father and mother for his own utility. In his early adulthood, when he falls in love and chooses a spouse, he experiences loving another person for the first time. Of course, this is not true for all people. That is, he comes out of his cocoon, and he and his spouse become a single self. He starts to desire for everything for this bigger self. A total of two selves become one. Of course, this is true if the concerned person is really in love with his spouse, a feeling which is described by the Qur'an with the words of mawadda, affection, and rahmah, mercy. In Surah Rum, or Surah 30, verse 21, it states, "And of his signs is that he created for you mates from your own selves, that you may take comfort in them. And he ordained affection and mercy between you. There are indeed signs in that for a people who reflect." So long as the relationship of spouses is carnal or sexual in nature, naturally they treat each other as a tool. The sexual relationship is an animal or bestial function. In satisfying the sexual instinct, a woman is nothing but a tool for man. So is man for a woman. But the issue of husband and wife, the family circle, the philosophy of family or the familial spirit, transcends the sexual instinct that exists in opposite sexes. That is, they love one another, and when they become old, where the sexual desire gets weaker or eliminated, familial love, that is, the love of family and affection between them, exists and even grows stronger day by day. In fact, in the words of modern scholars like Will Durant, in his book, The Pleasures of Philosophy, the affection of spouses becomes stronger on account of extensive interaction and communication between them, and this affects them so much that their physical features gradually become similar, like their faces. In other words, their souls gradually become so compatible that their bodies also gradually become compatible and their physiognomies become similar. This is the first stage in which a person comes out of the shell of the individual self. For this very reason, marriage has a moral dimension in Islam in spite of its being a sexual matter. And this is not the only matter which, notwithstanding its sexual or carnal basis, has a moral dimension as well. For example, eating per se never acquires a moral dimension, while marriage in itself has such a dimension. Satisfying any of the carnal instincts of man has no bearing on his spirituality except that of the sexual instinct. As such, marriage is labeled sunnah or recommended in Islam. The reason behind this is that as the affection of the spouses to each other intensifies, the more they are detached from their individual selves. As the self becomes bigger, it gets diluted. It is like a concentrated liquid substance which, if mixed with water, gets diluted and increases in quantity. Experience has shown that those who remain single without any wife or husband or offspring throughout their lives on account of certain spiritual objectives have a certain kind of defect, at least in the form of immaturity. It is said that man has a kind of spiritual perfection which can only be attained in the sphere of family life. Not all spiritual perfections can be attained in all arenas and spheres. Take, for example, the case of bravery in facing an enemy. Can a person become brave by means of reclusion and struggle against the carnal desire? Bravery cannot be acquired by a person except in the actual arena of jihad. If a person wants to acquire bravery, that person must actually go to the arena of jihad. A tradition from the noble messenger, peace be with him, and his progeny. There is a prophetic tradition which is recorded in Sunni sources, stating, "He who dies without having fought or having felt fighting to be his duty will die guilty of a kind of hypocrisy." Except facing an enemy, nothing can take this kind of hypocrisy away from a person. It is exactly like swimming. Can a person learn to swim by reading all the books written about it? No. Unless he tries to swim for some time, submerging in water for many times, involuntarily drinking some water and getting annoyed, he cannot learn how to swim otherwise. Bravery cannot be acquired except through facing danger for one's life or facing an enemy in the battlefield. One must acquire such a state of being that when he faces someone who is determined to kill him, he spontaneously takes a defensive posture to parry the threat against himself or take it a step further and eliminate the enemy. These things cannot be learned by reading books only. The Aesthetic Man and Jihad in the Way of God. Rumi has narrated a story of an ascetic man. Since this ascetic man had already performed different kinds of righteous deeds and meritorious acts with the exception of jihad, he asked a number of soldiers to inform him the next time there was a campaign. He was told to get ready for such a campaign the following day. One day, while sitting together after an encampment, they were informed of an enemy attack. Those who were always ready immediately mounted their horses and faced the attacking enemies, or forces. As this ascetic man was looking for his sword and chainmail while reciting some incantations, wird, and remembrances, dhikr, the fighting concluded, and he began to set off. His fellow soldiers were already running. He asked what happened. They said, "We set off, slew, and were slain, and then returned." He said, "Strange. What shall we do then?" They said, "Nothing. The fighting is over." Finally, someone pitied him and presented a captive to him. He asked, "Can you see this? He is one of the enemies who slew many of our horsemen until he was taken captive. Now he must also be slain. Take him away and behead him." The captive was handcuffed. The ascetic man took the captive to behead him. A long time passed and he did not return. When they followed him, they saw that the ascetic man had fallen down and the captive had fallen on him, and things had gone the wrong way. The captive was about to behead the ascetic man when they arrived and killed the captive. They brought the ascetic man to a tent and sprinkled water to his face, and thus brought him back to his senses. They asked what happened. He said, "As we set off, he looked at my face once and said, 'Get lost,' and I did not understand the rest." Bravery cannot be obtained in night solitude, just as the effects of night solitude cannot be obtained in the battlefield. There is a set of moral traits that cannot be acquired except through forming a family which fosters concern for the fate of others. Unless a person marries and has a child whom he loves much, and for example, he is agitated when his little one is sick, or he is delighted by his smile. He cannot possess this feeling by means of studying a book. Experience has shown that the moral figures and ascetics who did not pass by this stage had a kind of immaturity, or reasons why marriage is considered sacred and a form of worship in Islam, while according to Christianity, single life is sacred and marital life is an abomination. Only those who cannot endure single life are permitted to marry. It means that they will be corrupted if they remain single. So they are told to marry in order to prevent a greater corruption. As such, the Pope is elected from among bachelors who have not been tainted by marriage throughout their lives. In contrast to Christianity, it is stated in Islam, love of women is among the traits of the prophets. So marriage is the first stage of exit from the natural individual self and development of one's personality. After marriage, when one wants to find a job, it is no longer only for himself. The I turns into we, in that one becomes so much concerned with his family's well-being that he forgets his own, and he is willing to endure suffering for the sake of his family. This is the degree of the self. But is it enough for one's self to develop to that extent? There is no doubt that it is not enough. Relative to the natural individual self, this is a degree of perfection. Yet, if it is limited only to the extent that this self is promoted from an individual I and turns into I plus wife and children to the exclusion of others, it is still not enough. The tribal I. It is possible for one's self to develop further to include his clan, for example. That is, the individual self even goes beyond the familial self and includes the clan or tribe, as we can observe in the Bedouin and pre-Islamic Arab tribes. The pre-Islamic Arabs did not distinguish between themselves and members of their tribes. In other words, it was as if all members of a tribe constituted a single soul. I was a tribal I. Within a tribe, all human principles like generous disposition, beneficence, and self-sacrifice existed, but they were non-existent beyond the tribal circle. Thus, it is not enough that one's I develops only to that extent. The nationalistic I. Let us move further and deal with the nationalist I. Concerning us Iranians, for example, if a person is a nationalist that he loves all people of Iran as he does for himself, it is still not enough because beyond the national circle, he regards everything as permissible. He does not tell a lie to an Iranian. He does not betray an Iranian. He renders service to an Iranian. He is kind to an Iranian, but he considers it permissible to tell a lie to a non-Iranian. He deems it allowable to infringe upon the rights of a non-Iranian. He believes that cruelty is acceptable. It is the same self which exists in Europe. It means that the nationalist self develops and the individual I has evolved into the nationalist I. To a great extent, Europeans are not traitors to their respective countrymen. They neither tell a lie nor are cruel to others. But beyond their respective countrymen, they tend to be cruel and oppressive to others. They regard it permissible to tell a lie or commit treachery to others for the sake of national interests. That is, a European refrains from committing treachery and crimes within his country, but he is willing to commit the most heinous crimes against the people of other countries. He takes possession of the wealth and riches of other nations for his own country, and he takes pride in being a nationalist. No doubt such a person who, at least within his own country, is not confined to the individual self, in the sense that he lives there in the form of we and not I, and is more perfect compared to a self-centered person who is only concerned with himself in the world. Yet, this cannot be called morality. Logically, it cannot be accepted that one has nothing to do with other nations. Humanitarianism. Let us move a step further and proceed to humanitarianism. If someone is really humanitarian, he must render service to all human beings and not betray any person for the sake of that person's being a human. It means that the ultimate limit of exit from self-centeredness is to love all human beings. In this form, one's self refers to all human beings on account of their humanity. There's also an objection to this theory. Why should we be humanitarians and not animal lovers? What is this limit for? Is it logical to have such a limit and to confine the self within oneself? Or we can go beyond this to truth-centeredness or God-centeredness. Since God is a being that does not physically exist alongside his creatures, in the course of worshiping God, all things in the world become lovable. In Persian poetry, it says, "To the cheerful world, I am of the view that the cheerful world is of him, God. I am in love of the entire world as the entire world is from him, God." Let us return to the question about humanitarianism. Is it the limit of the self and confined to it, or can it go beyond that? And there is no reason to set the limit. Moreover, there is another question regarding humanitarianism, and that is, what do we mean by human in saying humanitarianism? Every animal or inanimate object is as it is. In saying love of flowers, the flower is as it is, has no other essences. The same with animals. But man is the only being in this world having both actual and potential states. In other words, one cannot count him as merely a creature with a head and two ears and say that humanitarianism means to love this straight-postured creature wherever he is. One cannot do so. Man has also a sense of humanity. A person can be inhuman, but we do not have an anti-animal animal. An animal is always an animal. Man's humanity depends on a set of concepts, realities, and subtle points, and anyone who lacks them or is against them cannot be considered human. Now the question is, if a person becomes anti-humanity or against fellow human beings by oppressing them, infringing upon their rights, or corrupting them, many cases of which we know of, should he be loved on the ground that he is a human being after all? Or should he be eliminated? In the latter case, how can this act be reconciled with humanitarianism? The reply is that if humanitarianism means to love this two-footed animal, the human being, then there is no difference between the true human being and the inhuman one. But if we say that we mean something by humanity, quote unquote, then man is a meaningful being. He may possess this meaning of humanity, or he may lack it, or he may be against it. In this case, the concept of humanitarianism for us acquires a different meaning. That is, human beings must be loved along the path of humanity and not against it. For this reason, if a person is against the path of humanity, at times he must be opposed in the strongest possible manner. We must uncompromisingly deal with him. He must be treated as a thorn along the path of humanity. This gesture is in itself a form of love for humanity, that is, to oppose an inhuman being for the sake of humanity is in itself a form of love for humanity and the human race, but it refers to a human race with a sense of humanity. Religious self. At this point, one may say, you come forward to enumerate different levels of the self. You make mention of the individual self, the familial self, the tribal and national self, the racial self, and finally the human self. How about a religious self? It is also a kind of self. Can it be exclusive for us? We ourselves say that Muslims must love one another. Muslims must not have a cordial relationship with non-Muslims. In Surah 48, verse 29, it states, "They are hard against the faithless and merciful amongst themselves." If segregation were bad, then it also would be bad here, and it would be an immoral act. The reply is this: If this belief were really to manifest as a form of prejudice, ta'assub, in the sense that a Muslim has a bias in favor of anyone who is within the fold of Islam, and as such he is also biased against anyone who is outside the fold of Islam, and that the former is benevolence or kindness, while the latter is the opposite, this is also not good, and Islam does not want it either. Islam wants us to be benevolent to all people or all members of the human race, including the faithless or the kuffar. Even enmity with the faithless is immoral if it stems from malevolence. We should not wish ill or bad for the faithless. Instead, we must follow the behavior of the Holy Prophet, peace be with him and his holy progeny, who said a statement to the effect that I pity them for not realizing what is good and rightful for them. However, if they themselves decide not to be guided, and in addition to this, they pose as thorns along the path of others, then they must be treated as an impediment. But one should not be malevolent to them. One must not be malevolent to Abu Jahl and say, for example, may Abu Jahl not testify to the formula of faith, Shahada, and not become a Muslim. We must not wish for Abu Jahl and his likes not to find the right path. Even when Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, asked Imam Zainul Abidin, the fourth Imam, whether the door of repentance was still open for him or not, despite committing the horrendous atrocity against his father Imam Hussein, Imam Zainul Abidin, peace be with him, replied that it was still open. That is, even the Imam, peace be with him, was not malevolent toward Yazid by wishing the door of repentance to be closed to him for killing the Imam's father, because of which Yazid would be thrown into the hellfire. Instead, the Imam remained benevolent toward him. We say we hate them in the sense that since they are not along the path of their own felicity and they pose an impediment for others, we must be inimical to them or harsh towards them. Goodness to the unbelievers. Thus, enmity toward the unbelievers stems from the love of others and wishing well for them, and not out of malevolence toward them. One can be good to an unbeliever to some extent, provided that this goodness is not a burden to others, not a burden to humanity, and not detrimental to the interests of humanity. In Surah 60, verse 8, it says, Allah does not forbid you in regard to those who did not make war against you on account of religion and did not expel you from your homes. Allah forbids you only in regard to those who made war against you on account of religion and expelled you from your homes and supported others in your expulsion, that you make friends with them. That is, God does not prohibit you to be good to those unbelievers who have not ill-treated you or waged war against you on account of religion. God prohibits you to be good to those meant by the above verse, the inimical ones, because goodness to them weakens the Muslims. For example, if a person sells weapons to someone whom is at war with, obviously this act will contribute to his defeat. Any support that would weaken the Islamic front is prohibited, haram. Any act of goodness to an unbeliever which necessitates undermining the Islamic front is prohibited. Any act of kindness to an unbeliever which necessitates the undermining of Islam and weakening the Muslims is prohibited. If Islam is the truth and if Islam is the way to human felicity, as it is, then the said act must be prohibited. But an act of goodness to an unbeliever that does not have those features is not prohibited. Rather, it is even wholesome. The parameter of man's exit from self-centeredness is basically not limited by anything including man. It embraces the entire world of being and existence, but the world of being moves along the path of its perfection, that is, along the path of worship to God, love of the truth, and whatever God wants for the world, which means felicity, in the sense that one must desire whatever God desires for himself. Exit from self-centeredness in its true sense will be realized if it is not confined to any domain including that of human beings. As such, we do not have anything called humanitarianism in Islam if it limits us to human beings. What is at the core in Islam is God, or the truth. The scope of many elements in Islam is wider, while that of others is, of course, narrower, not in the sense, though, that one must be malevolent to another person. Instead, it means that in practice, one cannot behave the same way to all people. One must have a specific behavior toward those who want to be an impediment to the truth and its seekers, and they must be treated as enemies. Their case is like that of a decaying tooth that must be extracted, but this does not mean that a person is malevolent with respect to his tooth. Instead, the situation reaches the point if it is not extracted, it will be a source of toothache, and the decay will spread to the other teeth. Universal conscience. Therefore, the universal conscience, quote unquote, mentioned earlier does not only refer to the love of all human beings, but rather something higher than that. It is the love of all things, while practically removing all obstacles along the path of perfection, as both man and the entire universe are not stationary. There are examples of the belief that Islam focuses on the principles of humanity and not on each individual. For instance, in addressing the Muslims, the Qur'an states in chapter 5, verse 8, "O you who have faith, be maintainers as witnesses for the sake of Allah, of justice, and ill-feeling for a people that should never lead you to be unfair. Be fair, that is nearer to God-wariness, and be wary of Allah. Allah is indeed well aware of what you do." That is, rise up for God's sake and give witness with justice. Your animosity towards people should not lead you to be unjust. This is addressed to the Muslims. The enemies referred to were the unbelievers of the period of ignorance who were idol worshippers. Apart from having the worst trait, that is idol worship, they were arch enemies of the Muslims. Yet the Qur'an states that they must not be treated unjustly, because justice is a fundamental principle. It is not only a human principle, but rather a universal principle. In other words, a person who follows the truth cannot be unjust. Injustice is something negative, even if it is done toward an inimical unbeliever. Similar to this point is the famous statement of the Master of Believers, Imam Ali, peace be with him, who addressed to Malik Ashtar, which is recorded in Nahjul Balagha, or the Peak of Eloquence, where the Imam states, "Do not stand over them like greedy beasts who feel it is enough to devour them, since they are of two kinds, either your brother in religion or one like you in creation." The reason for this is that justice is not only anchored in a humanitarian foundation, but also in a universal foundation. The commander of the faithful, Imam Ali, peace be with him, noticed a blind old man from among the non-Muslims living in his state, who was begging. Imam Ali, peace be with him, asked, "Why is he begging?" He was told, "He is a Jew. He was able to work before, and now he is a beggar." The Imam, peace be with him, replied, "Strange, he used to work while strong, and now he has to beg?" And therefore he ordered some amount from the public treasury to be allotted to him. In reality, this is a kind of retirement pension plan. In sum, the point is that there is nothing wrong with goodness and extending help to an unbeliever if it does not undermine the Islamic front. We have so many narrations which record that a Jew or a Christian became a Muslim and sought the advice of the Imam of his time on how he should behave with his non-Muslim parents, and he was told to behave as good as before, or even better. End of chapter 13.